Hello everyone and welcome back to the FFS podcast, For Finance's Sake. First things first, apologies for the delay in getting episodes out recently. I've been absolutely floored with a cold and honestly it's not been possible to record for a few weeks. Every time I tried, I sound like a man slowly being suffocated by a lemon sip. But we are finally back. I still have a touch of the cold, so please bear with. I'm Rachael Chadwicks Harrison, Chartered Accountant, Managing Director at Chadwicks in Warwickshire, where we spend our days helping business owners, families and individuals make sensible financial decisions and occasionally talking people out of spectacularly bad ones. And joining me today is Joanna Coleman, Senior Accountant here at Chadwicks, also has a bit of a cold, please bear with, part of my team and our in-house inheritance tax specialist. Joanna, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, although I feel this episode may trigger both of us slightly.
Well, yes, because today we are talking about trusts, or more specifically, what I'm calling the trust trap. Because I read an article on Apple News over the weekend about families being persuaded into complicated trust arrangements to supposedly protect their inheritance and avoid care fees. And honestly, it hit home because I've been saying it for years now. The majority of ordinary families, trusts simply don't make sense. Yet people are still getting sold these things like they're the financial equivalent of a magic spell. Apparently, if you put your semi-detached house in Coventry into a trust, HMRC just disappears in a puff of smoke.
Yeah, and unfortunately, that's not quite how tax law works.
No. Sadly, HMRC tend to read legislation before breakfast. So let's talk about what people are being sold. Joanna, what's the typical sales pitch people are hearing?
Well, it's usually something along the lines of, put your home into a trust and you'll avoid inheritance tax, avoid care fees, protect the family home and keep everything safe from the government. And it's often marketed very aggressively to older people.
And always with terrifying urgency. Act now before Labour change the rules. Act now before the council takes your home. Act now before HMRC steals your children's inheritance. It's basically Dad's Army meets Wolf of Wall Street.
And the important thing to say is trusts do have legitimate uses for vulnerable beneficiaries, business succession, complex estates, asset protection in certain circumstances. But what we see far too often are ordinary families with straightforward estates being sold incredibly complicated structures they simply don't need.
And paying thousands of pounds for the privilege. Now let's move on to the 175k problem. This is the bit that people genuinely don't realise. Joanna, talk us through the £175,000 residence nil rate tax band.
So in addition to the standard inheritance tax nil rate band, many people can also claim an extra £175,000 allowance against their main residence if it passes to direct descendants.
And for married couples, that effectively means up to a total £1 million can potentially pass tax-free.
Correct, but certain trust structures can mean you lose access to that additional allowance completely.
This is where it gets ridiculous. People are sold a trust supposedly to save inheritance tax and accidentally lose one of the biggest inheritance tax reliefs available. You just couldn't design a worse outcome if you tried.
And often nobody explained that risk to them properly.
Because explaining it properly would probably ruin the sales pitch. Moving on to care fees and the big myth. It's the biggest emotional trigger in all of this. The council can't take your house for care fees, which, it sounds fantastic until reality arrives.
Exactly. Councils are very aware of these arrangements now, and they can challenge them under deliberate deprivation of assets rules.
And in plain English, that basically means if you gave your assets away specifically to avoid paying for care, the council can still assess your assets as if you own them.
Yeah, especially if the timing and intention are obvious.
So this idea you can simply stick your house into a trust at 75 after a Parkinson's diagnosis and somehow outsmart the local authority. It's fantasy football tax planning.
And families are often shocked when they discover the trust doesn't actually achieve what they thought it would.
I'm shaking my head here. So the big HMRC issue, it's a classic. I'll put my house into trust, but I'll still live there. Joanna, what happens with that situation?
Well, in many cases, HMRC still treats the house as part of your estate for inheritance tax purposes, under what's called a gift with reservation of benefit.
Which is probably one of the most brutally honest names in tax legislation ever created. Translation? Nice try.
Essentially, yeah. If you still benefit from the asset, HMRC may still include it in your estate.
So people think they've moved the house outside their estate, but they're still living in it, still paying the bills, still controlling it, still gardening angrily every Sunday. HMRC says that's still your house.
Yeah.
So moving on to the CGT nightmare. This is where things can get properly ugly for families later on. Capital gains tax. Talk us through it, Joanna.
Well, because trusts don't benefit from tax treatment in the same way individuals do, families can end up facing large capital gains tax bills when assets are eventually sold.
Which is incredible when you think about it, because under normal inheritance tax rules, many beneficiaries would inherit assets with an uplift in the base cost anyway.
Exactly. But because the assets are moved into trusts years earlier, families can end up with avoidable gains, extra reporting requirements, and ongoing trust administration.
And then after someone dies, the children come to firms like ours holding 3 lever arch files and saying, well, Mum said this would simplify things.
And unfortunately, unwinding trusts can become legally and administratively expensive.
I've genuinely seen situations where the legal fees, accountancy fees, and tax costs massively outweighed any theoretical benefit. And in actual fact, I've seen clients come in where their assets have been in trust from their parents and they wouldn't have actually had to pay any inheritance tax at all. So you've just created a massive bill, which just wasn't necessary in the slightest. Which leads us nicely into the next section, the hidden tax charges. So nobody mentions this at the free seminar with the stale coffee and the biscuits. Trusts themselves face tax charges.
Yes, depending on the type of trust, there can be 10-year anniversary charges, exit charges, ongoing trust tax returns, higher tax rates, and administrative costs.
So instead of beating the system, you've basically created a small angry side business for your children to manage after you die.
And that is often how it feels.
Oh, now, to be fair, because I can already hear financial planners typing angry LinkedIn posts, trusts absolutely can be useful in the right circumstances.
They absolutely can. There are situations involving vulnerable beneficiaries, blended families, business assets, agricultural property, complex estates, and succession planning, where trusts are extremely valuable.
The key point is this: proper trust planning should start with the family's actual objectives, not with someone trying to terrify pensioners at a hotel seminar. And I think that's the message, really. For the majority of ordinary families, simple is often better. A well-written will, good estate planning, understanding the tax rules, using available allowances properly. That's usually far more effective than some convoluted structure somebody sold you with the phrase, the government doesn't want you to know this.
And getting proper regulated advice before making any major decisions.
Exactly, because once the assets are transferred into trusts, undoing mistakes can become expensive, stressful, and in some cases near impossible. Joanna, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you all for listening to another episode of the FFS podcast. If today's episode made you suddenly nervous about a trust you or your parents were sold in 2014 by a man named Nigel with a Bluetooth headset, please speak to a qualified professional before making any decisions. And better yet, come to us and do your inheritance tax estate planning. We'd love to speak to people and find out how you can save inheritance tax legitimately and knowing all the benefits and risks in doing so. And most of the time, it doesn't involve trust. So until next time, remember, FFS, check the numbers.